comes from 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 5. You can find it in the Old Testament on page 271. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." Let us hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God.
And on this day, when we live in the aftermath of what our president said about Haiti and about many of the African nations, we do indeed need to wise up. Those comments were horrible. There's little room in a civilized society for those sentiments and those expressions. Now, I told myself long ago that if I changed my sermon every time this racist vulgarian said things like that, I would probably never preach my planned sermon. But those were beyond the pale of the way we should live together. And I could not live with myself if I did not say that and say that to you this day. We are better than that. And let us wise up as a people. So let's turn from that topic to sexual harassment. I thought, in light of the Me Too movement, it would be appropriate for us to think together as a community of faith about the issues and the concerns that we hear about in so many different places, to understand that what our mothers and our sisters, our spouses, and our daughters experience is also out of bounds. And as a bold people of faith, we should say something. We should say something. I was shocked and horrified. This week, I like to watch PBS for the news. And this week on PBS, Judy Woodruff was interviewing Gretchen Carlson. Gretchen Carlson was a longtime news analyst for Fox News. Interviewing her because she's taken over the task of the Miss America pageant. And as a part of the interview, she spoke about a moment in her professional life. She did not say for whom she was working, but I think I know who it was. She went into the interview to her boss and described the added value she was bringing to the organization. And she thought, in light of the added value she was bringing, she deserved an increase in her compensation. The response was horrible. Her supervisor said, "If you want a raise, get up on my desk, and I can't bring myself to say what she said next. But if you Google it, you can find it online. A capable, a brilliant contributor to our common life was demeaned, reduced down, sexual harassment that was ugly and shameful. And because of the Me Too movement, we all know that that happens far more frequently than we are willing to acknowledge. I remember scrolling through my Facebook feed a few weeks ago, and so many of the people, the women that I value and respect, had that on their page. Hashtag Me Too. This is not what our mothers and our sisters and our spouses and our daughters should be exposed to. And we should get angry about it, and we should demand that it stop. So in light of these thoughts, I did a little research on what women's lives might have been like through the varying periods of the developments of Scripture. And realized how little we know about what women's lives were like. If you read the Bible from the first page in Genesis to the last page of the book of Revelation, you will meet 1,400 individuals. Those are persons with a name and with a life story. I'm sorry. 1,400. 1,300 of those names and life stories will be male, and 111 of those names will be female. You see, there's something wrong with us if we choose not to see more than half of our population. If we do not pay attention to the prayers and the aspirations and the deep inner longings, and if we do not listen with patient kindness to the burdens that they bear. Now, throughout the pages of both the Old and the New Testament, we get a sense that perhaps that ancient Israel was very much an agricultural community. Probably most of the women who lived out in the countryside, their lives would be devoted, like most agricultural societies, to caring for the home, helping in the subsistence farming that was the way of life in ancient Israel, working right alongside other members of their family in the production of food. But we know so little. There are a few very terrifying stories in Holy Scripture, stories of women being mistreated, and they're so horrible that we seldom read them in public, but they are there. But there are also some wonderful heroic women that we meet in the pages of Holy Scripture. We meet one named Esther, who is Jewish, living in the time of exile, living in the Persian Empire. And through a rather twisted set of events, Esther becomes the queen, married to the king. And just when a horrific episode of anti-Semitism is about to break out, Esther speaks up, telling her husband that she too is Jewish, and out of the king's love for Esther, the king tries to make the Jewish plight more tolerable in Persia. There are heroic women in Holy Scripture. One thinks of Ruth and Naomi. When Naomi and her husband Abimelech move from Israel to Moab, they conceive and bear 2 sons. And those 2 sons marry Moabite women. And then both Naomi's husband and their 2 sons die. And Ruth and Oprah and Naomi are abandoned. But Ruth, with a heroic spirit, travels with Naomi back to Bethlehem. Ruth marries Boaz. They conceive a child. And the book of Ruth ends with Ruth taking this beautiful baby, placing it into Naomi's arms, and she is restored. And of course, the baby is Obed, who is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David, and the greatest king in Israel's history exists because of a courageous Moabite woman. We meet Mary, the mother of Jesus. And one of my favorites is Lydia. We find her in the book of Acts. She seems to be a very wealthy Greek woman who uses her wealth to support the Apostle Paul as he does his preaching by opening up her home and letting it become a base for the Christian movement in the Greek world. There are some very, very heroic women in our sacred narratives. Cherish those. Cherish those. But of all of them, I was drawn to the story of Bathsheba. Kelly, thank you for reading the first few verses of that story. I'll pick up and retell it now. Bathsheba seems to have lived in close proximity of King David. And while the armies were out doing battle, David recognizes Bathsheba. So David sends a group to go and talk with her, it says. And then Bathsheba comes to the palace. They are intimate. She conceives a child. But she's married to one of David's warriors. And a scandal is about to break. So David arranges for her husband to be at the most dangerous spot in the battle, where her husband dies. Scandal averted. Now, there have been some misinterpretations of the David and Bathsheba story. I think Gregory Peck and Susan Hayward did a movie together about it. I've never seen the movie, but they portray it as an epic love story, right along the same genre of Mark Antony and Cleopatra or Romeo and Juliet. I don't know if it was a good movie or not, but it's not very accurate to the text. Bathsheba probably had no ability to say no when the king's company went to retrieve her. Had she resisted, she could very well have been killed. You see, epic love stories don't begin in being taken. They don't involve murder of one's spouse. No, the story of David and Bathsheba cannot be explained as epic, romantic infatuation. The other common misinterpretation of the David and Bathsheba story is that Bathsheba is the seductress, blaming the women for what happened. You're familiar with that genre, are you not? That she knows the king's schedule. Maybe he's having some executive time, watching Fox and Friends and sending out tweets, I don't know. But Bathsheba knows. That's a horrible interpretation and no justification in the text for that at all. The one I find most humorous, I've told you before, but there's this narrative that says, it wasn't David's fault, it wasn't Bathsheba's fault, it was all a result of the conniving of the devil. The devil wanted to vex King David because he was such a righteous and holy man. So the devil turns himself into a bird. And as a bird, he starts pestering King David in the palace. And David gets so frustrated that he takes out his bow and arrow and he draws back and he shoots at the bird. Now, since it's not a bird, but the devil redirects the arrow. And the arrow flies over to Bathsheba's roof where she's bathing behind a curtain. But the arrow strikes the cord that cuts the cord that's holding up the curtain, and, well, you know, David just can't help himself. He's beheld her in all her beauty, and he's powerless over his impulses. It's not his fault. The devil conspired to make King David misbehave. No doubt Flip Wilson would affirm this interpretation. The devil made me do it. Oh, how good we are at telling stories to evade our responsibility, are we not? Let me give you the correct interpretation of the Bathsheba story. This story is not told contemporaneously with the events described. David lives around 1,200 years before the Common Era. And this story is retold probably 800 years later when Israel is in exile. And the historian is asking an important question. The historian is asking, what went wrong? Were we not the chosen people? Did we not dwell in the promised land? And why do we find ourselves living in exile? Why did God fail us? And as the historian tells this and other stories, the historian is saying that there are consequences for human actions, and that part of the reason we are in the mess we are in is that we have failed to be a responsible people, living up to what was asked of us in our covenant relationship with God. Perhaps we are simply living with the consequences of our own choices, choices that have echoed through generations. Well, in light of the Me Too movement, in light of Gretchen's humiliation, we might do well to ask ourselves, what's gone wrong? You know, Gretchen is taking over the Miss America pageant, and they're concerned that if they cancel the swimsuit competition, that nobody will watch it. I don't watch it anyway. But I think we know what's wrong. That for generations we have objectified women, we have reduced them down. And we're killing ourselves through that process. Well, what can we do? In my musing and in my thinking and praying this week, I came up with 5 things I think we can do and that we can do differently. And I hope you'll agree with them and join me as we do them. The first thing I think we need to do is develop a healthy perspective on human sexuality. Most of us find the topic so awkward, we do everything we can to avoid any type of conversation about it at all. And in the absence of any healthy discussion, all sorts of misinformation and confusion abounds. For you see, human sexuality is not about power over someone else. It's not about dominating someone and embarrassing them and humiliating them. But a healthy intimacy is about deep respect, a nurturing and a compassion. It's about being less lonely, and at its most beautiful level, it's about being understood and being valued. The first thing we can do is to get over our awkward discomfort about these conversations, that we might impart to one another the wisdom that we have gleaned from living. The second thing I think we must do is to raise our daughters to honor their own voices, to value who they are. And that means listening as much as talking. That means paying attention to how they experience the world. Validating them and caring about them. Thirdly, I think we need to teach our sons to be gentlemen. Life's confusing, but we're smart enough to get through the confusion, to talk about what is respectful, that no means no. The fourth thing I think we should do is challenge all inappropriate conversations that we hear, even if it is a bunch of guys in a locker room. We should challenge when we hear people say things that objectify and that demean. You see, it's not the responsibility of women to get us men to wise up. It's our responsibility to do that on our own as men. And even in locker room talk, we ought not to laugh. We ought to say that we are offended. One of my favorite lines in response to things like that is always, "Do you kiss your mother with that mouth?" We can challenge inappropriate conversations whenever we encounter them. And the fifth thing I think we need to do is stop seeing our mothers and our sisters and our spouses and our daughters as damsels in distress that require a male hero to rescue them. My suspicion is women are quite able to stand up for themselves. But we have to stop protecting the predators. That's what we do. And we have to stop that. And until we stop it, it will continue. Our mothers and our sisters, our spouses and our daughters are not damsels in distress that need to be protected. They just need to have a fair playing field to speak their truth, to be listened to, and to be honored. And it is horrible when we sacrifice that truth to anything else, to any other agenda. Well, I've said a lot, and I hope the words that I have said this morning are encouraging and empowering. I hope that we will go from this place as those who are willing to speak honestly and to speak up when the unacceptable things of this culture rear their ugly heads. It is indeed time to wise up, O men of God. Amen.